Namaste, everybody. Today, here we are here to discuss a very important subject with a person who knows this subject really well. Before I introduce you to him, I wanted to tell you that in the book Snakes in the Ganga, uh, towards the end, in the conclusion, we talk about the barbarians at India's gate, and we lay out one plausible future scenario, which includes the World Economic Forum. So we have the ultra rich who have partnered with the ultra left, and they are busy coming up with plans for all of us that affect all of us. They are laying down infrastructure, they are putting in laws, and today we are going to talk about the World Health Organization, which is a global organization. We're going to see who's behind it, what are their plans, and how does what the World Health Organization does affect your life personally. So I'd like to give Mr. Alex Newman a very warm welcome because he's here for the very first time. So, namaste to you, Alex, and it's great to have you here. And I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself briefly.
Very good. It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Alex Newman. I'm a journalist. Mostly, I'm also a teacher, educator, serve on a lot of boards here in the United States. And I've written some books, and I've been following, of course, the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum, the United Nations. My entire career, I've been traveling the world, following these people around, trying to document for the American people and the people of the world what these, I love how you put it, the barbarians at the gate, what they are doing, what they plan for humanity. It's absolutely dangerous, and there's no choice but to, excuse me, to come together and resist this if we want to maintain our freedoms, if we want to maintain our families, our religions, our ability to govern ourselves. It's an urgent threat to humanity. And of course, it's coming in under the guise of better health and prosperity and efficiency. But these are just marketing slogans. And so I've been very honored for the last 15 years or so to travel around and expose these people and their agenda.
What made you get interested in this subject? What were one of the initial signs that you saw that you thought you should dig into this rabbit hole a little further?
It's an interesting question, BJ. And I actually had a very unique upbringing. I grew up all over the world. I lived in 8 different countries on 4 continents growing up. And so I was going to these international schools, these very elite private international schools where they were training up the future managers of this global system. So I was being prepared unknowingly to help run this global system that's being built. And so I kind of grew up thinking all of this was good, that it's for the benefit of humanity, it's going to lead to peace. But as I started understanding what was really going on here, I realized that these were really just slogans and marketing terms that were being developed to promote these ideas, but that really the agenda was actually evil in the truest sense. And that is how I got involved in exposing this and ultimately trying to stop it.
Okay, great. Now, could you explain to us? We see the IHR, the WHO. So, could you tell us what these organizations are? Who is funding them? What is their agenda, or what used to be their agenda, and what has become their agenda lately?
Sure. So the World Health Organization is a subsidiary organization of the United Nations, and the United Nations, the marketing around the United Nations when it was created was that this was going to be an institution to maintain peace around the world. The idea was that World War II was catastrophic, World War I was catastrophic, and so if all the governments of the world, they like to say nations, but really we're talking about governments here, that all of the governments of the world should come together and have a forum to talk to each other and things. But the goal was always actually to eventually turn this into a one world government managing a one world economy. And that's not speculation. That's not me looking at the evidence and coming to a conclusion. That's me just reading their documents. Our Secretary of State here at the time, for example, our Secretary of State is like the equivalent to the foreign minister in India. He wrote a book called War or Peace. It was published in 1950, and he explained in very clear language that the eventual goal was to turn the United Nations into a one world government, a world federalist system. He believed actually that this could be accomplished under the Charter of the United Nations. So even the existing charter, as it was written in the 40s, was adequate, he believed, to a one world government. And then you look at the people who were involved in creating the United Nations. Very troubling group of individuals. The Soviet Union, of course, represented by Joseph Stalin, one of the worst mass murdering maniacs to ever walk on this planet. He sent his foreign minister, Mr. Molotov, to represent the Soviet Union. Again, after World War II, the victorious powers came together to do this. The United States government, the other major superpower on the scene, sent an individual by the name of Alger Hiss. And he was supposedly representing us, and it was very bizarre that the delegates really liked this guy, so much so that they made him the chairman of the conference that wrote the UN Charter. Then they made him the first Secretary General of the UN. And then actually we prosecuted him. Our federal government here in the United States threw him in prison because he was a spy working for Joseph Stalin. So when you have these kinds of people coming together to create an institution that they eventually intend to become a world government, you need to be very, very careful. And so, look past the language that they use. It's not about peace. It's not about sustainable development. It's not about all these nice things that they tell us. It's about power. It's about control. Now, one of the most important elements of controlling the human being is controlling healthcare. Right? Every human has this in common. We all are going to need healthcare at some point in our lives, whether we get sick, whether we have some debilitating illness, whether we break a bone, we're all going to need healthcare. And so the totalitarians have figured out if you can control healthcare, who gets it, when they get it, what it looks like, how they get it, what are the conditions attached to it, you can really exercise a tremendous amount of control over human beings. And so the World Health Organization is one tentacle of this broader global system designed to bring everybody on the planet into subjection, but it's a very important one. Now, it has gotten progressively stronger and progressively more dangerous over the years, to the point where now, you mentioned the IHR, the International Health Regulations, they're now trying to amend this along with an international pandemic. They were calling it a treaty. Now they're calling it an accord because they weren't going to get it through the U.S. Senate here as a treaty. But what they're trying to do now is strengthen this organization to the point where it will start making decisions down to the individual level. They'll be telling national governments, like the government of India, like the government of the United States, what they need to be doing to deal with alleged pandemics, how people need to be treated, whether they need a vaccine, whether they need to be quarantined. And so if you thought the last 3 or 4 years of COVID craziness was bad, you have not seen anything yet if the WHO gets its way. And I saw on the little slide that you put up, and I'll stop here, this excellent Venn diagram where you have the ultra rich and the radical left, the ultra left, working together on this. It's a perfect summation of what we see in the UN and the World Health Organization. And actually, the Director General of the WHO is really the perfect encapsulation of this. He was put there with help from the communist regime in China, the most murderous dictatorship that's ever existed in human history. They've murdered about 100 million of their own people, not including the unborn. So you had the communist Chinese put him in there through bribery, through deceit, through scandal, because he was an ideological communist. He was actually serving on the Politburo of the Tigray People's Liberation Front in Ethiopia. This was an ethno-Marxist terrorist organization, was declared by many governments. And then on the other side, you didn't have just the ultra left, you had the ultra wealthy, the ultra rich, people like Bill Gates, who were huge supporters of Dr. Tedros. So Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, who's now running the WHO, is the perfect representation of what you just illustrated, with the ultra left and the ultra rich working together to take control of humanity and to abolish our freedom.
Now, the WHO and the European Union have announced a global vaccine, digital vaccine passport as a pilot project, I'm assuming, which they will roll out to everybody else. Now, to push back a little, they say that it's to protect citizens across the world from ongoing and future. Those are their words: ongoing and future health threats, including pandemics, and they want to give everybody quality health services quickly and more effectively. So what's wrong with that? So the average citizen says, so what's wrong with that? Here we can put everybody on a digital platform. We can track and trace and give people healthcare quickly, effectively, and efficiently. So what's wrong with that?
Well, we need to understand that when totalitarians tell us that something is for our own good, that's a lie. And that has always been the case. I mean, if you go back and you listen to all the totalitarians, just pick the last 100 years, they never come out and they say, hey, we're going to make you all slaves. Hey, we're going to take away all your freedoms. Hey, we're going to destroy your families and reduce you to the status of people who don't get to make decisions. So they would never say that because people would resist, and they would resist very vigorously. So they always have to come up with storylines for how this is going to be for our own benefit. Now, I would encourage people to think through the implications of this. The pilot program that you mentioned is extremely significant. They want, and actually, before we even start on that, the European Union was working on this long before anybody ever heard of anything called COVID. I've got documents from May of 2019 where they proposed that by the year 2022, everybody would need one of these vaccine passports, one of these digital certificates. And so what they're doing here is they're trying to control the movement of people. They're trying to control access to healthcare, and they're trying to create a single a dossier is probably the best word, where they're compiling all these different sources of information on each individual in the world, putting them all together in one central repository, and then making that accessible to any government, to any authorized person, with the click of a button or with the scan of a smartphone. And I think the best way to understand this, I believe the real pilot program for this system was actually started in China. They call it the social credit score, where every citizen in China now has a number that is based on a broad range of factors. And I don't think anybody except the people designing it really know all the different things that go into it. But to give you some sense of where they're coming with this, if you say ask questions about what the government is saying on social media, that's going to result in a lower social credit score. If you have friends who ask questions about what the government is doing, that's going to result in a lower credit score. And then this social credit score has an impact on every area of your life. Can you send your children to a good school? Can you get a passport to go to another country? Can you get on a train to go to the next city? If your social credit score drops below a certain number, you might even end up in a concentration camp. So this is very serious business. And what it does is it allows the regime to totally control, to micromanage the actions of every individual without actually having to deploy force every time somebody steps out of line. This basically causes people to behave themselves in the way that the controllers want them to behave without actually having to stand over them with a gun every moment, making sure that they're behaving. Why? Because every individual has an incentive to improve their credit score so that they can improve their life, etc. It's a very, very nefarious system. We also saw, I think, over the last 3 or 4 years, how movement was unbelievably controlled. Now, I'm very blessed to live here in the state of Florida. Florida was one of the few places in the world that said, we're not going to participate in this. They actually banned vaccine passports. Our governor and our legislature here, kind of like our state parliament, banned these ideas. And so we were very blessed here in Florida to not have to participate in this. But I traveled a lot, even while the craziness was going on. And I think that was really a warm-up for what they have planned. They ultimately want to eliminate all privacy. They want to eliminate all freedom of movement. They want you to have permission, not just to cross international borders, but even to move around within your own country. And this so-called health passport, these health certificates, they have to do with much, much more than health. And if you listen carefully to the World Health Organization and Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, they actually make this very clear in their own public statements. I was in Egypt a few months ago for the UN Climate Summit. The COP27 was on the Sinai Peninsula, and Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, the World Economic Forum, was very well represented there. And Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus comes out and he says, climate change is a public health emergency. And so they think everything that emits CO2 is contributing to climate change. That means, even us breathing emits CO2. And so if that's a public health emergency and we're going to have global health cards, how is all of that going to play into this? You have top American officials and top international officials saying that racism is a public health crisis, that gun violence is a public health crisis. I mean, literally everything can be a public health crisis. Well, what food are you eating? If you're not eating the right food, you might not be healthy, and then the government's going to have to take care of you. So we're going to now tell you what food you can eat. You can't eat this. You must eat that. It's a very, very dangerous path that they're on. And these so-called digital health certificate, these vaccine passports, these are the mechanism that makes all of the rest of it possible.
Now, let me ask you this. So it looks like what you're saying is like how you have ESG to control corporate credit score. You have now the WHO is going to, through health, is going to come up with a personal, individual health, individual social credit score. So that way the corporations are controlled, the institutions are controlled, and individuals are now. So this is sort of the final step, I guess, in laying out the infrastructure. Am I reading that correctly?
I think it's a brilliant analogy. It's exactly what's happening here. So the ESG scores are to get the corporations to do what the World Economic Forum and what the powers behind the scenes want. The social credit score is what they'll use for the individual. And these digital health certificates, these digital passports, these are the control mechanism to make all of that possible. And so people need to understand this is to bring about behavior change. This is to undermine individual freedom. Exactly what they're doing with the corporations with ESG is what they will be doing with people. And we've seen how these ESG scores are a mechanism that has caused, in America, it's very obvious, all these corporations are basically committing corporate suicide. They're alienating all their customers. It's not that the directors necessarily want to do this. It's not that the management wants to do this, but they need to increase their ESG score so that they can get access to capital, so that BlackRock will continue continue investing so that they won't oust the directors from the board of directors by voting our shares, right, in our pension funds and things like this. So this will have the same exact effect on individuals. Individuals may not want to report their neighbor for not complying. Individuals may not want to take, 55 different vaccines. Who knows how many they have planned for us? They're working on all kinds of things. Individuals may not want to, send their children to some crazy government program. But when all of that is factored into your score, and that score is going to determine where you can work, whether you can get a loan, whether you can travel, you have that very, very powerful incentive there. It's hard to overstate the danger of this. I mean, all of our freedoms are on the line if they proceed with this.
See, in 2005, under Kofi Annan, I think is when the ESG seed was planted, and it took them around 15 years for it to come to fruition, where you actually see like a Dylan Mulvaney campaign and ESG scores and things like that. Now, when do you think the seed was planted for the WHO to do this health social credit system? And how long do you think it will be when we see results on the field?
Well, they have been planning this for many, many years that we know of, right? Over a decade ago, they came up with this Better Than Cash Alliance. And you had the Bill Gates Foundation, you had the United Nations, you had numerous, the Rockefeller Foundation, all these very, very powerful institutions coming behind this idea that we need to get rid of cash. Around the same time, you had the birth of something called ID 2020. Again, Bill Gates, Microsoft, the Rockefellers coming up with this idea that we all needed a digital ID. And this wasn't secret stuff. They put up a website. They were putting out, I was getting the press releases in my inbox. And so they didn't tell you the end game, but they did say in there, we need everybody on the planet to have a digital ID. We want everybody on the planet to start using digital payments. And they throw in, some stupid marketing like this is going to solve poverty. And they never actually explain how getting rid of cash, how having a digital identity is going to solve poverty. In fact, it'll do just the opposite. But they don't have to, right? They just need a catchy slogan so that the useful idiots can come behind this and say, oh, that sounds like a good idea. So the agenda has been public for many, many years. And what happens with these campaigns typically is they're concocted in these kind of quiet meetings, Bilderberg, Trilateral Commission, all these secret and secretive organizations. They come up with these ideas and then they come up with excuses for, well, how are we going to sell this to the public? Because if we just say we're going to make you all slaves, we're going to control you, nobody's going to go for that. So they need to hire marketing companies and they do focus groups and they ask people, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? They do pilot programs in different countries. So my guess would be that these kinds of ideas have been bouncing around in the corridors of power for probably decades. And about 10 years ago or so, give or take, they were first unveiled to the public, and now we're watching them come to fruition. And then this is not a system that's going to be built overnight. Even if the EU and the WHO succeed with these digital IDs, even if they succeed in introducing central bank digital currencies, it'll be years before they completely eliminate cash, before you can't move around without using your digital papers. It'll be a gradual process. They'll start getting the children used to it in schools, and they're already doing this now. Right? In many, many schools across the United States, the kids have to have their thumbprint. They have to have their biometric IDs to be able to get their lunches, to be able to open their lockers. So they're getting the younger generations used to this. And as we get another generation down the line, you'll have maybe most of the people in the world thinking this is totally normal. This is how humans should live. So it's always a gradual process. We have a saying in the United States, the frog in the boiling water. If you just throw the frog straight into the boiling water, he's going to jump right out. But if you put the frog in the water and gradually increase the temperature, he doesn't realize it until it's too late and he's cooked.
Right. And see, the WHO has an abysmal track record, as we've seen in the past couple of years with the COVID crisis, right? Nobody trusts the WHO. I think many people have their doubts. They've said the vaccines were over 95% effective, and they ended up being, just causing less severe disease. Maybe that's what they said. The mask mandates were again a totally useless thing. And the mainstream media doesn't talk about it. Now, why are countries like India, who managed this pandemic through this crisis, why are they signing up to this WHO treaty? First of all, tell me what this new WHO treaty is doing, and also tell us, why are countries so freely giving up their sovereignty? Who's behind it? What is it that incentivizes them to give up their sovereignty? Everybody, we have 190 odd countries ready to sign this. So why are they doing this?
What they do is they put in place a complex system of incentives. And so they recognize that different people are motivated by different things. Many people, in fact, most people around the world, are motivated very strongly by money. So if you promise people money in exchange for taking some action, many of them, maybe most of them, depending on the money, there's always the saying, everybody has a price, right? And I don't know whether that's necessarily true of everybody, but certainly most people have a price. And so money is always a huge incentive structure. One of the tools that's very, very widely used in the United States, in Washington, D.C., for example, is blackmail. We saw this so clearly with Jeffrey Epstein. This is a guy who was flying some of the most powerful men in the country, including Bill Clinton, including Bill Gates. I mean, some of the most powerful men in the world are flying around the world with this guy in his private jet. They're going to a pedophile island. They're being invited to have sexual relations with underage children. This is a very serious crime in the United States. And so, what happens then is once these photographs exist, once this evidence exists, these people have to be controlled. I mean, it's a very simple matter to say, look, you're going to vote this way. Or those pictures that we got of you last year on the little island that we were at, you wouldn't want those on the front page of your newspaper, right? I mean, you imagine what your wife would think. Imagine what the people in your town would think. Imagine what the voters would think, right? You might even get prosecuted. So there's a lot of different mechanisms they use to control people, but money is one. Power is one, right? There's almost this unspoken understanding in Washington, D.C., that if you want to advance in your political career, you're going to do what the establishment wants on the key issues of the day, whether that be the World Health Organization or global IDs, whatever the key issue is. And you can say whatever you want on television. You can, rabble rouse. You can tell the voters whatever they want to hear when it's election time. But when the time actually comes to vote the way that the establishment wants you to vote, if it's not the money, it's the blackmail. If it's not the blackmail, it's the power. And so you have this different incentive structures, but it works very similar in almost all the countries of the world. It's, it's because it's part of human nature. Humans are relatively easy to control, especially the kind of people who gravitate toward political power, right? There's something about political power that it tends to attract the worst kind of people, the people who want to lord it over their fellow human beings. And so you have all of that combined into this soup. Now, you also asked about these policies that are being developed by the WHO. So they had the amendments to the international health regulations. They have a series of amendments. Some were adopted, some were approved last year. And if the governments of the world don't reject them, they will go into force in the next few months. They also have been working on the International Pandemic Treaty, which now they're calling the International Pandemic Accord. The first drafts that I saw, extremely problematic. These would allow the head of the World Health Organization to declare what they call a public health emergency of international concern, which I think quite appropriately should be pronounced fake. And so if the Director General determines that there's a fake, then all of these complex systems kick in, all of these protocols kick in. And basically the head of the WHO, who, as we mentioned earlier, happens to be a former communist, backed by communists and Bill Gates and other billionaires, he gets to decide how governments must respond to this. Now, one of the amendments that was proposed actually requires governments to establish a person within each government or an office within each government that would be in charge of implementing the WHO decisions within their country, within their respective governments. So very, very problematic on that front. There's also, under the guise of equity, mandatory wealth redistribution. So if the United States has more vaccines, so-called, than other countries, then the United States would be required to give them to make sure that everybody in all the other countries has enough. It is basically establishing a global health authority. Now, the latest revisions to the treaty that were just released pretty recently here, and they're calling it the Bureau text. I have not even had a chance to go through the entire document yet, but what I've seen so far and the experts that I have spoken to who have had an opportunity to go through this, there's a whole nother element that really has not been talked about here much, Vijay, and that is genetics. Right, there's this obsession among the elites. They want to archive and control the genetic material, not just of every person on the planet, but of every living being on the planet. And they want to commercialize it. They want to modify it. They want to own it and patent it. So when they talk about biodiversity, we think, oh, they want to save a woodpecker in the Amazon rainforest. No, they want to archive all of this genetic material so that later they can combine it, they can patent it, they can license it, and then they can use it to manipulate anything they want. And I know that sounds weird, but that's the direction they're moving. And as you read the text for this latest International Pandemic Accord, what you'll find is that this is a central element of it, and it's now starting to come into view.
Now, what is the end game? Is it deep? Some people say it's depopulation, is the end game. And while they are trying to achieve that, there are signs that that show that some of, when you talked about Epstein, what I was thinking of also was the UNESCO is trying to de criminalize pedophilia by calling say, pedophiles as minor attracted persons, things like that. And they're bringing it into education. They are trying to make sexual right as a fundamental human right, so which from a legal standpoint changes everything. Because if an adult can have basic fundamental human rights, sure, so should children. So children should also be able to engage in sexual activity. So this is all getting to a very dark place and a slippery slope. Has the Do you think they are trying to destigmatize and decriminalize pedophilia in general?
There's no question about it. And they've been working on this for a long time. I've been sounding the alarm about this for a very long time. There are schools in the United States now where they're actually teaching children. And I've got the videos proving this, where they say that, pedophilia is just a different sexual orientation. So we have to teach the kids about pedophilia. And so that is one of the end goals. And you mentioned depopulation as well. There's no question about it. And again, this is not something that we're speculating about. We've got the videos of these people speaking. We've got the documents from their organizations where they say publicly that they believe there are way too many of us on this planet. They believe that the number of people on Earth right now is not sustainable, that this number needs to be dramatically reduced. I mean, Bill Gates said in a TED Talk that, he wants to use vaccines and so-called reproductive health care to reduce the population of the planet by 10 or 15%. And he doesn't think that's enough, but he thinks it's at least a start. Now, he'll say that's because less children will die if we vaccinate them all and so on. You can believe what you want about that, but he's been very clear about his desire to reduce the number of people on the planet. And of course, he's not alone. The Club of Rome, these people have a fanatical, I would say almost a religious style belief that there are too many people on the world, that we are cluttering up their planet, and that these resources really should belong to them, and we are just taking up space. Now, when they talk about an overpopulation crisis, they could not be more wrong. We are headed toward a catastrophic decline in population around the world. And this is not just a European phenomenon. This is not just an American phenomenon. All over the world, we are headed for a catastrophic decline in population. And I know for people in India, for people in China, that may seem hard to believe. But if you look at the demographic trends, our populations, not just in the West, but around the world, they are falling off a cliff. The only exception to this is sub-Saharan Africa. And even there, the trends are now very rapidly headed toward population loss rather than population gain. So we don't have an overpopulation crisis. We are going to have a population crisis, exactly the opposite cause. We're going to have way too few people taking care of older people, unless somehow they manage to wipe out a huge percentage of the older population. So they do want a lot less people. They do want to normalize and ultimately legalize pedophilia. And ultimately, they want to create a global totalitarian system. And, people talk about it's communist, it's fascist. Really, a friend of mine, Patrick Wood, I think has hit the nail on the head. What we're really dealing with here is a technocratic global system where politicians, self-government are ultimately eradicated, and decisions are made by technocrats, by scientists, by engineers working for the global elites. And ultimately, I think when you get to the real core of the group of the forces that are driving this change, what we're dealing with is actually just plain evil in the truest sense of the term. These people are working for absolutely evil purposes. Everything good they want to flip upside down. They want to abolish family. They want to abolish religion. They want to abolish countries. They want to abolish private property and create basically a global plantation. And if you listen to them, Vijay, they believe they are going to become gods. They believe they are going to become some sort of superhuman rulers. And now we're getting into stuff that sounds like science fiction, but it's not. This transhumanism. Klaus Schwab, the head of the World Economic Forum, talks about the fourth industrial revolution, where we're going to see a fusion of our physical and our biological identities. One of his buddies, Yuval Noah Harari, talks very openly about how at least the elites, they're going to be upgrading themselves into gods. They're going to be manipulating their genetic material. They're going to be inserting technological implants, and they think they're going to be superhuman. In fact, Yuval Noah Harari, who doesn't believe in the God of the Bible, says we're going to be more powerful than the God of the Bible, because the God of the Bible only creates organic life. We're going to be able to also create inorganic life. So this is a level of hubris, of arrogance that is, I think, almost incomprehensible to a normal person. But when you put it all together, it paints a troubling picture of a group of absolute lunatics who are involved in a crazy cult from hell who plan to eliminate not just our freedom, our rights, our governments, our religions, but even our humanity. And so we must resist this.
Now, initially, when we started this program, we talked about the ultra rich getting together with the ultra left. Now, and the ultra left is essentially the group that is the useful idiots to the who do all of this work. Now, what happens when you become in our book we talk about Davos devatas, as in gods. So when these people achieve their goals, or in their process of achieving their goals, so, they get to transhumanism and become sort of demigods. What happens to the woke mob that is doing all the dirty work of dismantling family and institutions and religion and everything else that society has built up over millennia? What happens to them?
It's a good question, and the same thing happens to them that always happens to them. They get lined up against a wall and shot. And I hate to be so blunt about it, but that's what happens. And you just have to look back at the last 100 years, and you'll see this pattern over and over and over again. Once the useful idiots are done being useful, they are eliminated, almost in every case. And I think a lot of people think, well, I'm really close to the top of the pyramid, I'm going to be exempt from that. What they don't realize is that they're dealing with people who are not just amoral, they are immoral in the truest sense of the term. And so you take a guy like Joseph Stalin is a good example. This is a guy whose thought patterns were very similar to the thought patterns of the wannabe elite, right? They like us to think of them as elite, but the people Klaus Schwab kind of represents, the people he's a front man for. And what happened with the vast majority of Stalin's deputies is they were purged. They were executed. Out of his top 34 or 35 deputies, only a handful died a natural death. Most of them were put up against a wall and shot. You look at the people behind the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, Leon Trotsky ended up with an ice pick in the side of his head in Mexico City. And so what happens is, as they get closer to their end goal, they start turning on each other. They start murdering each other. And so this is not going to end well, even for the lunatics who think that they are helping to bring this about, and so they're going to get to be, co-rulers. It's going to end in disaster for them as well. But they're so prideful, they're so arrogant, they are so deceived that most of them don't even see that yet. It will hit them eventually. It will dawn on them once they break down the rule of law. Once the thin veneer of civilization is gone, it will eventually dawn on them that, whoops, we paddled ourselves up this creek and there's no way out. So it's going to hit them hard. The useful idiots will be eliminated almost certainly. And even the old revolutionaries. There's a wonderful interview that went viral some years ago with Yuri Bezmenov. He was a Soviet defector, and he talks about this. Right after the useful idiots are done bringing about the revolution, they have to be eliminated. Some of these people were idealistic. They thought we're going to bring about this utopia. We're going to whatever marketing slogan. We're going to have equality, whatever. And once they realized that it was all a lie, that it was all a fraud, they have to be eliminated. So, to the radical leftists who are on board this agenda, thinking that it's going to produce some sort of utopia, you're being deceived, and you will be thrown overboard when the time comes.
Now, what can you say about India's role in the WHO, and what is India doing? Because I think India was held very high as an example to the world because of the Aadhaar system. We had this digital ID system, and India rolled out the vaccine and produced vaccines, all of that. And India has sort of been held as an example in the rest of the world's eyes that this is how you should implement a pandemic plan. So anyway, so what do you think, from whatever you've seen and read and researched about how India has gone about with WHO and healthcare?
Well, I think the self-proclaimed elites, or the elitists, as I call them, I think they use India and many other countries. Sweden is another country that gets very often used as kind of a testing ground for these ideas. Now, I think it was a decade ago, I wrote an article about how India was becoming the first nation in the world to put everybody on a biometric ID system where everybody had to give their thumbprints, everybody had to give their biometric information. And so they are manipulating the people of India, just like they manipulate the people of every country, to go along with some of these policies. And when it comes to the WHO, the Indian government, unfortunately, has been very much involved in this process, very supportive of this process. And they've actually proposed some of the worst amendments that were out there, as James Roguski, the American researcher, has pointed out. So India, unfortunately, has been cooperating very closely with the WHO. But the same is true of virtually all major national governments. I don't know of any major national government that has really put up any true resistance to this agenda. And so different elements, different governments are being kind of put in charge of different areas, but we're seeing the same thing all over the world, where our political class is being subverted, where our politicians are being bought, and where our politicians are deliberately selling out their own people to this totalitarian global agenda. And India, unfortunately, is no exception to that.
Now, who is funding? I know the US funds uh, the United Nations as well as the WHO, but WHO itself is funded by China as well, I'm assuming. But who else is? Let's follow the money trail and see, who is funding the WHO.
Yeah, so the U.S. government historically has been by far the largest financier, and as we know, money talks. When the U.S. government withdrew from the WHO during the previous administration, during the Trump administration, the largest financiers then became Bill Gates. I call him Bill Gates of hell, and also the Communist Chinese government. And so that was no surprise. Again, we go back to the point that we started with. You have this, what seems to be, if you don't understand how the world works, what seems to be a very bizarre partnership between supposed super capitalists and then, on the other hand, communists. And that doesn't make sense at first glance. Why would capitalists and communists be cooperating? This is not a new phenomenon. And I think that's how the WHO needs to be understood. It's a collaboration between the worst criminals on the communist side and the worst criminals who pretend to be capitalists. Now, if you look at the people who I'm calling capitalists, they're not really capitalists in the true sense, in that they're creating goods and services that are satisfying a need for humanity and therefore making a lot of money. What we see with a lot of these guys is they're getting rich through manipulation, through extorting taxpayers, through crony relationships with governments. But Bill Gates and the CCP are among the largest financiers of the WHO to this day. And of course, Bill Gates really is almost a representative for big pharma. And so WHO should really be seen, I think, as a front group for the big pharmaceutical companies, for the elitists like Bill Gates who want to reshape humanity, and for the communists like the ones running communist China. And this is a toxic brew of totalitarianism and madness, and it results in the kind of thing that we saw over the last 3 years.
See, you spoke about the word treaty being replaced with the word accord, so that it passes through the U.S. Senate. Now, nobody in the mainstream media is talking about this. I saw your very detailed thread that you had researched and put out on Twitter, and that's how I reached out to you. So why is it that mainstream media, this is such a huge treaty where people are signing off their rights and sovereignty to an external party, essentially, and this has not made headline news in any of the mainstream media outlets? So why is that? Do you think even the media people are all bought out, or what's going on there?
Well, there's several things at work here. Now, all the things that I mentioned about the politicians apply equally to the media, right? There's the blackmail, there's the money. There's also an incredible amount of ignorance. I tell you, as someone who is trained as a professional journalist, who went through one of the top journalism schools in this country, the level of ignorance among the so-called journalists in the United States would absolutely blow you away. I mean, people would not believe how ignorant journalists are. And also ideologically, many of them are in lockstep with this. I mentioned at the beginning, I've been going to these UN conferences for well over a decade now, and I call the journalism section, I call it the cheerleading section. It's really unbelievable. And I mean, this is not how I was trained in journalism school. We were always trained to kind of be impartial, to take a step back. We're not part of the story. And yet, when you go to these UN conferences, you get some representative of communist China comes out and makes a big announcement, and these journalists they stand up and they clap and they give a standing ovation like trained SEALs. Like, what is going on here? So a big part of it is ignorance. Your average American journalist does not know the Constitution. Your average American journalist does not know how the U.S. government operates. And so this is something that probably slipped through their attention for most of them. And then to the extent that there are any people who do understand working within the media, once that gets up to a higher level, what you have is the media is, and if all you have to do is watch TV to confirm what I'm saying, as you're watching your nightly news broadcast, this news report is brought to you by Pfizer, brought to you by Merck, brought to you by AstraZeneca. I think at one point that even Fox News, which some conservatives very naively think is on their side, most of their advertisements are coming from the big pharmaceutical companies. And so if the WHO is a front man for the big pharmaceutical companies, and the big pharmaceutical companies are funding the media, we can't honestly expect the media to be honestly reporting on the big pharmaceutical companies and their front group, the WHO. So we have a conflicts of interest across the board here, and also an incredible amount of ignorance. All they would have to do is read the Constitution to understand how this works. So for the folks who aren't familiar with our Constitution, the U.S. government is allowed to negotiate treaties that are binding between other governments or even within international organizations. It has been interpreted as applying even to international organizations. But for those to be approved, they have to be ratified. They have to be approved by the U.S. Senate. 2/3 of our senators have to consent to these things for them to apply. Now, there's still some restrictions there. The federal government, for example, cannot grant itself new powers by signing on to a treaty. And this has been commonly understood since the time the Constitution was written. The people who wrote it actually wrote about this. In 1957, our U.S. Supreme Court upheld this once again in 1957 with the ruling Reed versus Covert. They said the federal government could not give itself new powers just by signing on to a treaty. And that's exactly what's happening here with this WHO agreement. The federal government does not have those powers constitutionally. Most of the powers that the federal government has are listed in Article 1, Section 8. These are the legislative powers of Congress. They can operate a navy. They can have a post office. They can, regulate commerce with foreign nations. So they're allowed to do some things, but they don't have the power to tell us what to do with our healthcare. They don't have the power to tell us what kind of treatments we can take. And so they certainly cannot sign a treaty giving these powers to a foreign entity. I mean, it's self-evident that this is ridiculous, and yet that's what they're hoping to do. Very few media outlets have pointed this out, and of course, there's no way that this so-called international pandemic treaty would get 2/3 support in our U.S. Senate. We've got many corrupt senators. We've got many senators who are blackmailed, but this is such an obvious diabolical power grab that there's no way 2/3 of the U.S. Senate would support this. And we've seen the same with the climate things, for example. And so they recognize that, well, if we're going to make this at least seem legitimate, we're going to have to do it through a different mechanism. And actually, it was Barack Obama that pioneered this concept of an executive agreement where we're not going to ask the Senate anymore. We're just going to pretend like it's a done deal. And so one of the things that's important to understand about this, the most recent version of the pandemic accord that was released, is that it's actually setting up a structure very similar to what they set up for the climate. On the climate, they set up the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And what happens then is every year you have an annual conference of the parties. And then this conference of the parties can come up with a new agreement. It's considered part of the previous agreement. And so there's no need to get these ratified as they perceive it each year with the Senate. Well, they're hoping to set up the same mechanism now on the health front so that every year the World Health Organization can convene a conference of the parties. They can adopt new changes, new restrictions on our lives, and they think we won't even have to go back to the U.S. Senate. Thankfully, we have a lot of checks and balances in our system. Many state governments are going to be resisting this and have resisted this. And so even if they approve this, it's not a done deal. The American people are not just going to roll over and play dead and accept this. But that's what they're hoping to do. And I think the reason why the media is not reporting it is ignorance and corruption.
Now, if the U.S. doesn't roll it out and there is resistance in the U.S. from different states, you think that would affect, because the US is such a big part of the WHO, it would affect the other countries as well, right? Would that have a domino effect across the globe in a positive direction?
I think it would. And even if it was just, inspiring people to realize they have the ability to resist this. Now, whether that would affect its implementation in another country, I can't say for sure. But I think as people started seeing Americans say, like my state of Florida, for example, our governor already came out just a few weeks ago and said, we're not going to be participating in this. This is not going to be enforced in Florida. The way our system is set up, our federal government is supposed to be relatively small. Most government is at the state and at the local level. If the federal government wants to try to enforce this, they're going to need help from state and local governments. Without that help from state and local governments, there's no way that anything like this could be enforced. And I've talked to lawmakers in different states around the country who already have bills filed saying our state will not only not cooperate with this, we will actively resist this. Most states in America are actually in the hands of Republicans. So if those Republican-controlled states say we're not participating in this, this thing is functionally dead in most of America. And I think that would have catastrophic impacts from their perspective on its implementation in other countries, because you'd have other countries saying, well, if the Americans aren't going to do it, why should we do it? Why should we subject our people to this? It would be, I think, a very positive development from a PR perspective, and I think it would encourage more resistance around the world. And I think that's what we're going to see if they proceed with this.
So can people not? So what are legal, you know, action? What is some kind of legal action that the normal person can take? Because we haven't voted for this. We haven't, you know, given permission, and somebody else is making decisions for the average individual. So is there a legal recourse, for this on an international level?
Well, unfortunately, the international so-called legal system is rigged against the individual and in favor of the institutions and the globalist agenda. And this is true at the International Criminal Court, which, of course, the United States has never ratified the Rome Statute, so we're not even participating in that. But all these international courts and tribunals, they are rigged in favor of this globalist agenda, and that has been true from the beginning. Now, every country has its own constitution and its own legal mechanisms, but especially those nations that still have or are even based on traditional British common law and the Anglo-Saxon legal system. You mentioned some very important things. We have never given our consent to this, right? I mean, and this has been part of the Anglo-Saxon legal tradition going all the way back to the Magna Carta, where even the wealthy, the nobles in Britain said, look, you cannot just do whatever you want, right? You're not God. You don't have ultimate power over life and death for every person in this country. And you need to respect the rights of these people. So this is something that has been in our legal tradition for 1,000 years almost. And this is something that they're hoping we forget about. But, we still have, especially in the United States and a lot of the Commonwealth countries, we still have a lot of those traditions embedded in our legal system. We still have the federalist system in a lot of countries, not just the United States, right? Switzerland is another really good example of this. They have a confederation where virtually all the power is actually maintained at the cantonal level. The confederacy, the federal government in Switzerland is very weak, very small, and almost powerless to act without the consent of the cantons. So there are some countries that have better legal systems, better legal structures, better judicial systems that are more suited for active resistance. But I think even beyond the whole legal side of it, Vijay, we have to recognize that as individuals, there comes a time where we just have to say no. And if we haven't passed that time yet, we're very rapidly approaching it, where people around the world are just going to have to say no. Not about, I'm going to go file a court case about this. Court cases are great. And, I think we should do those things. But even if we lose all those court cases, there comes a time where we just have to say, no, I'm not taking that injection. No, I'm not going to be locked in my house. No, you're not going to make decisions for me and my family. No, you're not going to teach that to my children. And until a lot of people start saying no, they're going to be able to continue moving forward with this agenda. But what I am encouraged by is so many people are starting to recognize this now. I think the last 3 years was tremendous. We're going to see many, many more people saying, no, we're not doing that in the years ahead.
It's very sad that during the COVID pandemic, it's easier to say no, when you're in a wealthy nation. I know many poor people in India, they depend on government ration, subsidized rice and dal and oil and things like that they get in the ration shops. And they pay for it, but at a subsidized level. And they were told that if you do not take the vaccine, you will not get your ration in India. So and that's how many people were arm twisted, because they could not, they couldn't staff, and they didn't have work at that time. So it affects the common man, the poor, even more than it affects the rich, who can sort of pull through in times of calamity and trouble.
Yep, you're absolutely right. And that's not unique to India. That's a mechanism that they're using in every country around the world. They want as many people as possible dependent on the system so that when they issue orders, we have no choice but to obey them. And that same exact principle, we saw it used here in the United States. The one vaccine mandate that was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court was the one involving healthcare workers. And why is that? If you read the Supreme Court decision, they explained why. Any hospital that's taking federal money through Medicare or Medicaid. These are two giant government healthcare programs in the United States. One is for poor people, one is for elderly people. Any hospital that's taking this federal money must obey these federal demands. And that's a principle that my dad always told me. When I was growing up, it was constantly, well, with federal aid comes federal control. And he didn't mean he was the federal government. He meant, I'm paying your bills. You live in my house. Therefore, you're going to do what I say. And so there has been a concerted effort to undermine our economies, to undermine the middle class, to undermine entrepreneurship, so that we all have to become dependent either on the government or these big evil corporations that are in bed with Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum and the ESG and the BlackRock. Because if you're dependent, it is much easier to control you. Millions and millions of people in this country took the shot because they were dependent either on the government or on the big corporations. And so I think as individuals, we need to work very hard to prevent that kind of dependence on structures and systems and entities that are far removed from our control, that are far removed from the will of the people. And so that same thing that you just talked about in India, they're using that all over the world. They do want us dependent on the government. And that's a very difficult thing to explain to people. But we're seeing the same thing in America now. Less than half of Americans actually pay taxes. Most Americans are net recipients of government money. And that's a very, very dangerous situation, because when you depend on someone for money, you have to basically do what they say, or you risk losing your livelihood. So I think we need to do everything we can as individuals and as families to try to protect our independence, to try to expand our independence, so that when these types of situations arise, we don't have to take orders that we don't want from people that we don't want to listen to.
So we have to have a parallel economy, is what you're saying. We have to arrange for our own sort of money and farming and barter system. Is that how the world is going, Alex?
I hate to say it, but yes. And I'm a big free market guy. I don't have any problem with big companies and things like this, as long as they're doing what companies are supposed to be doing, which is making money for their shareholders by serving the needs and wants of their customers. And for me, that's a good system. Unfortunately, we don't live in that kind of system anymore. We don't live in a free market system. And so I've been telling people for years, you need to get to know your local farmers. You need to go to your farmers market and find out, who's selling eggs in your town, who is selling, fresh produce. You need to get to know these people. Stop going to Walmart. And I've been telling people for a long time too, if you can diversify your sources of income, that's a really good thing to do. Maybe start a few small businesses in your home. Maybe, buy little stakes in local companies, and try to do your shopping locally with local people, with your neighbors, people who are not going to shut you out if you won't take some injection, people who are not going to force you to put something on your face if you want to go do your shopping. Because the more we transfer our economic power to Amazon and Walmart and these big wicked corporations, the more we allow them to control us, the more we allow them to put the systems in place that will ultimately enslave us. So yeah, parallel economies, I think, are going to be one of the most important things going forward. And I think that's why they want to eliminate cash, to go back to the digital IDs and the digital currency that we were talking about earlier. They're doing everything they can to eliminate all these avenues, but get together with people in your local community, come up with ideas, come up with plans. It's not just a thing that would be nice to do. It's going to become absolutely essential in the years ahead, unless there's some sort of radical change.
Okay, great. I'm going to try and take a few questions if we have any. Divya, if you can, give us some questions from the viewers. Um, okay, can you please list the major ultra rich? I think he already mentioned Bill Gates, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of them. One of the biggest families that is incredibly rich is the Rothschild family. They kind of hide behind the scenes. We all know George Soros, right? Well, George Soros got his start with Rothschild money. In fact, his bank that was set up in Switzerland was funded originally with seed money from the Rothschilds. And I mean, the Rothschilds are so unbelievably wealthy, and they have been for centuries, that an establishment historian, Niall Ferguson, actually wrote a book about them. And he said they decided the outcome of the war between Britain and France, the two most powerful governments in the world. One banking family determined which side was going to win that war. So that gives you some sense. There are the rich people that we're allowed to see, and then there's the rich people that kind of operate behind the veil, that operate behind the curtain. So we're allowed to see George Soros. We're not allowed to talk about the Rothschilds. We're allowed to see Bill Gates. We're not allowed to see the people behind Bill Gates. The Rockefeller dynasty is another big one, right? Of all the very powerful, wealthy families in the United States, the Rockefeller family has been right at the heart of this system for generations. And that continues today, even though David Rockefeller, the latest patriarch, has passed on. That family retains massive amounts of power. But even more than just the super wealthy, there are a number of institutions. I actually wrote a book on this. I wonder if I have a copy handy. But it's called Deep State, the Invisible Government Behind the Scenes. I do have a copy handy. Let me grab it. So it's this right here, Deep State, the Invisible Government Behind the Scenes. And in the back, I put a whole list of people. These are all the members of an organization in the United States called the Council on Foreign Relations. And there's about 5,000 of them. And the Council on Foreign Relations is kind of like the unelected government of the United States. And so you have several organizations like this, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg. Then you've got actual secret societies like the Skull and Bones organization at Yale University. You've got the Bohemian Grove out in Northern California. So there are networks of secret and secretive organizations. that have unbelievable amounts of influence. And I think that's even more important than who has the wealth itself, because these are the people that control the wealth. These are the people that oversee the major foundations that have, billions and billions of dollars. People like Larry Fink, who may not be himself one of the richest men in the world, but he oversees BlackRock, which invests $10 trillion worth of other people's money. So you've got a lot of these people, and I wouldn't say wealth is the only determining factor in how much power they have. But those are the organizations that I would say are critical to understand if you want to get a sense of who's calling these shots. And of course, I mentioned the Council on Foreign Relations. That's not acting in isolation. It's part of a bigger, what's called the Roundtable groups. In England, the counterpart is the Royal Institute for International Affairs. On the continent, they have the European Council on Foreign Relations. So there are networks and networks within the networks that kind of make these decisions, and they really operate outside of the public view, even though they have a website. And I think those, if you want to look for people who are responsible for this, those are good places to start.
Okay, great. Next question, Divya. So, what are some of the dangers of current proposition of the one world government? I mean, I guess we discussed a lot of them, but go ahead.
Well, I mentioned, and of course, there's the old dictum from Lord Acton that power corrupts and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. Right now, we have a system of nation states where if things get really bad in one nation state, people can leave, right? And that has been a major check on the ambitions and the power of political leaders, right? And we've seen this throughout history. When capital and labor and people and companies have the ability to leave one jurisdiction and set up in another, that acts as a very powerful check on the ambitions of totalitarians and politicians. When you remove that and there's nowhere to flee, there's nowhere to go, there's nowhere to escape, suddenly that check on their power is removed and they can do virtually anything they want. So it's a very, very dangerous situation, and it's almost inevitable. I mean, even just from a philosophical perspective, if you have a system with total power, it's going to attract the worst kind of people. It's going to attract the people who want that power for evil purposes. So even just on paper, it's a very, very dangerous idea. If you look at the people who are driving this movement, you'll understand what a truly bad idea it is.
Okay, next question. Does EU want to become an all-controlling socialist leaderless state? What is the end goal of the WHO?
Yeah, so the EU wants to become one regional hub in a broader global system of control. Now, Henry Kissinger, who's one of the architects of this global system, he actually has been very, very clear about what he's doing. He put out a book in 2014 called World Order, where he explains that what they want to do to get this world order is to create a system of regional orders that would then all eventually be merged into the one world order. And this is the strategy that they've been pursuing for decades. Zbigniew Brzezinski talked about this. He's the guy who joined up with David Rockefeller to form the Trilateral Commission. And so what we see now is the world is rapidly being divided up into regional governments. Putin is building the Eurasian Union. They're building the Indo-Pacific Union. They're building the Middle East Union. They're putting the African Union right now on the Africans. In Latin America, they've got the Union of South American States. In Southeast Asia, they've got the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. What they're trying to do is set up these regional governments that would basically usurp and undermine the sovereignty of nation states, so that then these regional, unaccountable, unelected organizations like the EU can then surrender their power to the one world system. And again, this is not speculation. This is what they themselves say in their own speeches, in their own documents. They're very openly working toward this goal. And so the EU is not going to be an end in and of itself. The EU is a means toward usurping sovereignty and ultimately moving us all toward this global system. And of course, the end goal of the WHO is to become the global health arm of the one world government.
Do you have some more time to take a couple of more questions, Alex?
I've got about 1 minute left, Vijay. I've got another interview that starts in 1 minute.
Quick last question, and then we will close. How can people escape this vaccine passport being imposed on them?
Well, I would say there's several things. One, make sure you are not entirely dependent on, say, the government for your food or one big corporation for your money. Make sure you're networking in your local community. Get connected with local farmers, local businessmen, your neighbors, and actively resist. I mean, go to your political leaders and make sure that they are not going to support this. If you live in a particular state or in a particular local jurisdiction, work with your local officials or your state officials or your cantonal officials, depending on where you live, and tell them, hey, we expect you to protect us from this. Your job is is to protect our rights from this terrible idea. So there's a lot we can do. There's a lot we must do. And I can't encourage people strongly enough to get involved. I mean, there's nobody else that's going to do this if you don't do it. So pick up the phone, call your local politicians, ask for a meeting, and start figuring out ways where you can operate outside this system, because we may need to do that in the years ahead.
Thank you so much, Alex, for all the wonderful work you're doing and spreading this information and awakening people all over the globe. So, we really thank you for your time, and we should have you again sometime soon as you venture out further and give us more insights into what the globalists are up to. Thank you so much, and namaste.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Really, thank you very much. It's an honor, and hopefully we'll talk very soon.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.